Emily, are you there?
I am.
All right, excellent. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the third in our series on with our partners at ODVN on intimate partner violence on campus. Today we have Emily with us to talk about understanding barriers to leaving and safety planning, which is a great complement to the work already provided by both her colleagues, Michaela Deming, who talked to us about legal remedies, as well as Nancy Grigsby, who talked to us about lethality assessment. So I'm so glad that you could join us today. A couple housekeeping items. I am recording this webinar. So if you yourself would like a copy of this later, or any of your colleagues, you can simply email me at the conclusion of the webinar, and as soon as WebEx makes it available, I'll be happy to send that out to you or to whomever you'd like to share it with, or who requests it. Also, if you have a phone, cellular phone, or a tablet that you're working on during the webinar, I just ask you keep it away from your computer, your main computer or phone, however you're listening in today. We have had issues in the past with some feedback disrupting the presentation. You'll also see there's a chat room on the screen. You can use that to pose questions to Emily throughout the presentation, and I'll be happy to share that with her as she may have breaks and whatnot. It's also, if she has any questions for you to participate in the webinar, that would be a great place for you to provide that feedback to her questions that she may pose. So that is it for my announcements today. Emily, thank you again for doing this, and I'll turn it over to you.
No problem. Thank you, Carrie. So as Carrie said, my name is Emily Culo. I am the Accessibility Project Coordinator for the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. I work on a couple of different projects here at ODVN, including providing best practices, training, support for survivors who either have possible head injuries, severe mental health, or are addicted to opioids or other substance uses, dependencies. So I do a couple of different things here at ODVN. I come from a background of working in shelters. I worked for about 11 years in shelters in Northeast Ohio. So I did everything basically from running visitation centers to running the shelter to facilitating support groups and running a outreach / legal advocacy program. So I just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit today about understanding the different barriers that survivors of domestic violence, intimate partner violence often face, as well as ways that we can best safety plan with those survivors to make sure that the impact that we are having on survivors is very meaningful and useful. So today we will be focusing on the dynamics of coercive control. My goal today is to allow you guys the opportunity to identify life-generated and abuser-induced barriers to keeping specifically students, but all survivors of domestic violence and intimate partner violence trapped in abusive relationships. My goal is that you will learn how to effectively safety plan with students in abusive relationships, and that you will learn strategies for working with campus partners and community organizations to reduce barriers. So please, if you have any questions, as Carrie said, you can enter them into the chat box. I want to make sure that I'm answering questions as we go. I know sometimes it's hard to wait until the end, so don't feel like you have to wait until the end to ask questions. So what you see on your screen is the social definition of intimate partner violence. Domestic violence or intimate partner violence is a pattern of coercive behavior designed to assert power and control over another individual in a relationship. So this is a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors. It can include anything from physical, sexual, and psychological attacks, as well as we see a lot of economic coercion. And this is something that somebody in an intimate relationship will use against their intimate partner in order to assert power over another individual. So when we're talking about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, this is when one person has an overt amount of power over the other. When we're dealing with individuals who maybe are younger, we often hear that maybe that the power is not as identifiable. So a lot of times in domestic violence relationships where partners are married, the power can seem a little bit more identifiable. One person is the person that works outside of the home, and it's easier to keep the other person isolated in the home. But we do see power and control imbalances in student relationships as well. So that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on more today. So when I talk about power and control, we can be talking about anything from the direct or indirect coercion and threats that we often see. A lot of times we hear more about the direct physical threats of violence. That's often when the police might be called or there's some sort of intervention that we see. However, a lot of the power and control issues within an intimate partner relationship are going to be things that maybe people don't know about as much or there aren't as many remedies for. So there is a lot of emotional abuse when we talk about domestic violence or intimate partner relationships. There is a lot of isolation, and this can be anything from very serious isolation where somebody keeps somebody else locked inside of a house while they leave and go to work. But more often than not, we see a lot of isolation when we are talking about somebody who distances this person from their family and friends or any support system. So it could be that anytime they pick up the phone to call their mom or they call their friend, their abusive partner is in the background giving them a hard time about that, to the point that it's then not worth it to that individual to pick up the phone and call their mother or their friend anymore. And that isolation can kind of creep up slowly. A lot of times we'll have survivors that then will, find themselves a few months into this relationship and realize that their support systems have stopped reaching out to them because they're frustrated and they don't know how to help the situation. And that can be very, very dangerous, because when we have the support system fall away, when that person is looking to get help or to leave a relationship, if they don't have anybody that they can identify to reach out to, we see that it's a lot harder then to leave that relationship. And we'll talk a little bit more in a little bit about the different challenges to leaving these relationships, but isolation plays a big role in that. We also will see a lot of intimidation. This can be anything from actual, as we said before, threatening, but it's a lot of body language also. So you'll have abusive partners who like to back people up into a corner, literally, so that then when somebody who maybe is smaller than them is backed into a corner, they feel very scared and will do and could lash out at the other person. That's often sometimes when we see defensive marks on an abusive partner, and then that abusive partner will call the police and say, she hurt me, when in fact it was just that the survivor was backed into a corner and scared and lashed out. We see a lot of minimizing, and a lot of times when we are talking with survivors of intimate partner violence, they will do a lot of minimizing. And part of the reason of that is that they have constantly been told by the abusive partner that this isn't a big deal, or that I only did this because you did something wrong, or strangling somebody or putting their hands around your neck isn't actually as dangerous as we know that it is. So that you'll see a lot of minimization on the part of the abuser that then will trickle out into how often survivors will explain these events to us. We see now a lot of power and control around technology. So things like cyber stalking, actual physical GPS tracking our smartphones have little GPSs inside of all of our phones, and if you don't know how to shut off those location services, sometimes abusers who know their way around a smartphone can have access to all of that information, as well as things like pictures on Facebook. You can actually find out where a picture was taken. Just regular monitoring of social media accounts and questioning any time that a picture is taken with another individual, or who that person is with, or what they can share on Facebook or Instagram. We see a lot of economic abuse, and this could be forcing the survivor to pay for the abuser. This could also be in relationships where the abusive partner has the main income. You could see a lot of controlling of that money and what can be spent, tracking how much is spent at the grocery store, or anything like that. And then we always see an element of gender privilege in these relationships as well. When we talk specifically about college power and control, this looks very similar to everything we just talked about. There are certain things that stand out to us when we talk about this population. Specifically, not letting somebody study or keeping them up for an exam is a big one. Anytime that you know that there's something important that's coming up, say this person has a job interview or an internship interview, and the abuser will know to pick a fight with the survivor right before that to throw them off, and so that they might not get that internship or they might fail that exam. And then again, that keeps that power in the hands of the abuser versus the survivor. Keeping survivors from their friends and schoolmates. Again, this is something that we talked about with isolation. Isolation is huge when it comes to intimate partner violence. The more support and social contacts that a person has, the more they have the ability to see from somebody else's point of view what's going on. So the more friends that I have, they can tell me that, hey, what this abusive partner is doing to you is not right, and they can give me more resources, and then that in turn gives me more power, so that I am more likely to walk away from that relationship. So again, when you're looking at this from the abuser standpoint, they don't want any of that control. They don't want that survivor to have any of that control, and so they're going to isolate survivors as much as they can in order to keep that control. We see a lot of abuse of power. So when we talk about people who are abusers, normally these are people who, to the general public, come across very charming and very good people, for lack of a better word. So a lot of times abusers will go into relationships and they'll be on their best behavior in the beginning. They're going to be what we would kind of say as the perfect partner, being overly generous and overly kind. Also, we will see a lot of quick involvement. So they're going to want to get their partner in a relationship and in a relationship quickly, so that they can have a better chance of asserting that power and control over another person. To the outward person, these people are going to look very charming and very nice, and they're going to present a very good front to the rest of the world. I know that a lot of people probably see news reports after something horrible has happened, after some tragic domestic violence homicide, where you'll have neighbors or you'll have family members of the abuser or coworkers of the abuser that will say, I just never, this is completely out of character. I never would expect this person to do this or to act this way. And unfortunately, that is very, very common. The abusive partner is going to want the rest of the world to think that this is not something that they are capable of doing. And so that when the victim or the survivor of this intimate violence speaks out or does anything, then the rest of the world can say, oh, no, this couldn't possibly be right. This is certainly not this individual, behavior that could do this. So we see a lot of that. When we talk about intimate partner violence, we see a lot of escalating violence. So again, this isn't necessarily going to be the very first time the physical violence happens that it is the most severe time that the physical violence happens. It can very well be a very severe incident the first time, but generally speaking, that's not how that works. So the violence will get more severe as time goes on. There, as I said before, there is a lot of emotional abuse that goes along with it. There's a lot of sexual abuse, which is also something that when we're working with survivors of this violence, they're not going to tell you as quickly as they may tell you about some of the other violence that's occurred. Some of that is because they feel embarrassed or shameful that it has happened. Sometimes it's because they don't know to identify it as sexual abuse. There is still a lot of misunderstanding about what is sexual abuse, what is rape, and whether, two people in an intimate relationship, whether there can be sexual abuse, which obviously there can be. So when we are working with people who are in these relationships, it's very important for us to validate to them that, sexual abuse is absolutely a part of domestic violence or an intimate relationship violence. So, so that they can understand that this isn't just something that they should be expected to accept or to deal with. As I said before, there's a lot of monitoring of social media sites nowadays. There will be a lot of destruction of property. When we talk about things like destruction of phones, we see that a lot when we're dealing with these relationships. One of the primary reasons that we see that is because it keeps the survivor from calling the police or calling a friend or a family member for help. And actually that can be an additional charge when we talk about charging these people with domestic violence. So we see also a lot of endangering pets and children. In a little bit, we're going to talk about the reasons why it's hard to leave these relationships, and that pets and children are going to be one of the very big reasons why it's hard to leave these relationships. So if you have somebody that is threatening your pet or your child, you're going to be less likely to leave for fear that could happen. And then, as always, it's a very possessive and controlling behavior that we see. So when we talk about why don't they just leave? So that's something that unfortunately even today we still hear a lot about, and I think it's a hard thing for people to kind of wrap their minds around, that if you were in this relationship, that it's not just a matter of, well, why don't you just leave? So I implore you guys to think about a time in your own life when you maybe needed to make a change. You don't have to type it into the chat or anything like that, but just think to yourselves about a time that you might have had to make a change. And this can be a small change, it can be a big change, it can be anything from a time you needed to move, or you needed to switch jobs or careers, or you needed to move to a new city, or any of those times that we've had to make a change in our life. And when you think about that, what is it that, why didn't you leave or make that change immediately? So what are things that kept you from making that change right away, or what slowed that process down for you? So was it things like money, any sort of finances? Um, were there things that contributed to you not making that change, leaving behind family members? If you didn't want to leave the state because you didn't want to leave family behind, would your children be affected by this change that you made? Would you have to switch schools for your children? Would your children maybe not get to see specific family members as much, and that can impact why we make those changes? Does fear play a part in why we didn't make those changes? And Carrie, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. So when we talk about why don't they just leave, or why don't they just, get out of this relationship, it's a lot easier for us on the outside to ask that question without thinking of how it would be for us to make those changes. And there's a lot that plays a role in that. So when I used to work in Northeast Ohio, and I worked for programs up there, and then I had this opportunity to move to Columbus, and that would require leaving behind my family, which is only a couple of hours, but it's still a couple of hours away from my mom and dad. I had a partner and a 4-month-old baby at the time, and so leaving behind the grandparents of my son, that played a large role in me maybe not wanting to leave, or maybe not leaving as quickly. And so I just implore you all to think about that before we jump to those assumptions that it's easy to leave or make a change in our life. And when we talk about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, all of those things are amplified by like 100. So when we talk about barriers to leaving for us might be hesitations, but barriers to leaving for a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner violence could be the difference in life or death a lot of the time. So it's very important to understand the weight of that when we're working with individuals who are in these relationships. It's absolutely understandable that we do come into it with our prejudgments about a situation. Everybody does, and if we say that we aren't prejudging a situation, we're probably lying to ourselves in some way. But it's also important to keep those in check and understand where that is, and not ever allow the people that we're helping to see any of those. And we want to do our best to really understand the motivations behind a survivor for staying in these relationships. So we're going to talk a little bit about life-generated barriers and abuser-generated barriers, and what's the difference between those. So life-generated barriers are anything from obviously a lack of money, social or peer pressure from our faith organizations, discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, distrust of authority or our police, cultural or religious beliefs. So these are all life-generated risks that can barriers that can affect all of us anyway. So when we talk about an intimate partner relationship, these are going to be amplified and also tied to the behaviors of the abuser. So when somebody has a lack of money, it could very well be because the abuser is the person that is the main income for that family. The abuser may not allow the survivor to have a job outside of the home, and so then they can't save up enough to even be financially dependent or independent and leave that relationship. when we talk about things like discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, that can tie into things like our distrust of authority and police. So if you have somebody that is a male in a same-sex relationship, is that and a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, is that person as likely to feel comfortable going to the police as, say, a woman who is in a heterosexual relationship? Are they going to be treated with the same amount of respect when they try to call the police to be able to get out of that relationship? So all of that kind of plays in together and is very important in understanding the specific life-generated barriers that each individual that we're working with could possibly be affecting them and could possibly be keeping them in these relationships. And then obviously cultural and religious beliefs, which you are probably seeing a lot on college campuses, because you have people from all sorts of different faiths and cultural backgrounds, and all of that can play a role in whether or not they can leave a violent relationship. So then we start to talk about the abuser-generated risks. And again, I remind you that all of these play into one another. So you have all of these things that the abuser has done that we've already talked about, things like isolation and controlling of finances and threatening and stalking and psychological harm. All of that then plays into the life-generated barriers that we have seen, and it just makes it extra difficult to be able to leave a relationship. Some big things that is very important to understand when you're talking with somebody that is in an intimate partner relationship is that fear is a very real thing when we talk about leaving a domestic violence relationship. The most dangerous time, and I'm sure many of you have heard this statistic, but the most dangerous time for a person in an in a domestic violence relationship, is when they are leaving or right after they have left an abusive partner. And the first 48 hours is the most dangerous, but what we see is a lot of times that the first 2 years after somebody leaves a domestic violence relationship is the most dangerous time period for them. So that is a very real fear. A lot of times, and I know that it's kind of hard to wrap our minds around the fact that a lot of times that it is actually safer to stay in the relationship than it is to leave. So in a little bit, when we talk about safety planning and what that looks like for survivors, it's very important to keep that in mind, because a lot of times we have people on the outside that are telling these survivors, well, you just need to leave. You know, a lot of times when the police come out, they say, well, you just need to leave. You need to go into shelter. You need to get away from this guy. And I understand that their intentions are good. Our intentions are always good, but it's also a little bit nearsighted to say that. We are ignoring and possibly doing a great disservice to survivors when we tell them that they just need to leave. And so we will be talking a little bit about safety planning and what that looks like in a real practical sense here in just a little bit. So one of the things you definitely want to be aware of is some of the behaviors that you will see when working with survivors of domestic violence. I always tell people that there is nothing like working with survivors of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, because trauma actually changes how the brain looks and then how it functions. So we will see certain behaviors that we maybe don't understand where it's coming from, but then when you understand a little bit more about the trauma and the trauma that they've experienced, it can help us understand that this behavior is absolutely normal for the person. So trauma decreases our ability to connect with others. It decreases our ability to manage and regulate feelings, to self-soothe. Trauma decreases our ability to trust others. And that can be twofold. That can be because of the actual trauma that they've experienced and what it has done to the chemical processes of our brains. But it can also be because survivors of intimate partner violence have specific experience that gives them reason to not trust people on the outside. So maybe they've had bad responses from the police or from external resources or agencies that then make it harder for them to trust anybody. So trauma also decreases our ability to thoughtfully plan, have the energy to get things done, and to tell stories. And this is a really big thing because oftentimes when we're dealing with somebody who has had any sort of trauma in their life, but specifically domestic violence trauma, we ask them to tell their stories kind of a lot. So we ask them to tell their stories when they're calling to come into shelter. We ask them to tell their stories once they're in shelter or they're working with a case manager. We ask them to tell their stories when they're maybe meeting with a prosecutor or a judge or asking for a protection order or when there's a criminal case. So we're asking them to tell their stories a lot. And a lot of times those stories maybe aren't consistent. So maybe what they tell the police is different than what they're telling their advocate at the shelter. And maybe what they're telling their advocate at the shelter is different than what they're telling the prosecutor. And it's important to understand that that doesn't mean that this person is lying or isn't being truthful in what they've experienced. It could be that they actually have an inability to tell that story in a linear fashion. It could be that they have blocked out certain things depending on when they've told that story. So if they told this police officer something, there could be bits and pieces that they don't remember because their adrenaline is going in that moment and they can't quite remember. And then a couple days later, they're talking to an advocate and certain things come back to them. Also, these traumatic events often are happening over a long period of time. So this isn't usually just one traumatic experience that they're experiencing. So it's hard to remember what happened. Unfortunately, a lot of times these incidents can run together for a survivor. So it's important to understand that when we're talking with survivors. Trauma also increases tension, anxiety, panic, and emotional volatility. It can increase need for control and aggressive behaviors. So sometimes we'll have people that we're working with that it almost seems like they are exhibiting some abusive behaviors themselves. But what is really happening is that they have a increased need for control because of the trauma that they've experienced. Trauma can increase the need to avoid people, places, and reminders of the situation. So things can trigger that traumatic event. And one thing we understand about trauma is that healing from trauma doesn't happen overnight and isn't a linear process. So crisis can act as a wave, and we can feel like we're getting better and we are moving past that trauma, and then something will happen, or they'll see something, or they'll smell something that can trigger that traumatic event and will put them all the way back at the beginning in that survival mode again. Trauma can increase constriction and numbing of feelings. Trauma can increase disassociation and disconnecting. And then we often see, because of all of this, trauma then will increase the use of drugs, alcohol, or other addictions to manage feelings. So, a very common way of avoiding people and places and being able to numb our feelings is by using drugs or alcohol. So we do see an increase in that. It's very important to keep in mind that that abusers will often attempt to introduce drugs and alcohol into a survivor so that there can be partners who force survivors to become addicted to drugs or alcohol, which again will keep them in that relationship, especially if their abuser is the person that can give them the drugs or the alcohol. So that's important to also understand. It's also important to understand that drugs and alcohol do not cause domestic violence, which is a very common myth. That is absolutely not true. So understanding all of that trauma then allows us to make sure that when we are working with survivors, that we are doing so in a trauma-informed way. So ODVN is big on being a trauma-informed organization, and we implore all people that come in contact with domestic violence and intimate partner violence survivors to find out really what it means to be trauma-informed. And so when we talk about being a trauma-informed agency, we are talking about anybody from local domestic violence agencies, health centers should be trauma-informed, culturally responsive and inclusive organizations, counseling services that are trauma-informed and knowledgeable about intimate partner violence on campus or in the community. So any of these organizations that are coming in contact with people who could be in domestic violence relationships, which is basically anybody, should look at becoming trauma-informed and making sure that we are approaching all of our work in a trauma-informed way. So health centers, it's more than just asking, are they in a safe relation? Are they safe at home? Which is often something that we hear about. But it means going beyond that and what else can we do to make sure that the people that we are coming in contact with are safe, and if they aren't, how do we help them? So one of the ways that we can always help survivors is by understanding the basics of safety planning. Because anybody can do this. So we always tell people when we're training advocates in programs that if we do nothing else with the survivor, making sure that we're safety planning with them with a little bit. And even if that's just as simple as giving them a couple of numbers so that the next time they need to make a phone call, they have the correct numbers. And they know one little bit of information that will help them. So when we talk about safety planning, safety is more than just not being killed. It is also more than just leaving a relationship, as I said before. So when we talk about safety, we're talking about physical safety. So we're actually talking about how do we help survivors with the ability to keep their bodies safe from harm. And there are a lot of different ways that we can do that. It's again, and you'll hear me say this kind of repeatedly, it's important that we're listening to the survivors and what they identify as their skills and what they identify as ways that they can keep themselves safe, and helping them identify those things. So we're also talking about psychological and emotional safety, the ability to be safe with oneself and others, and having access to environments where it is safe to express yourself and your feelings. We also talk about social safety, the ability to be safe in groups, which includes people respecting each other and their differences. And we talk about moral safety, access to environments that support honesty and justice. So a safety plan is a process. It is not a piece of paper. And a safety plan is going to look very different for every person that we are working with. Traditionally, we used to think of a safety plan as actually a piece of paper, and safety plans did used to be pieces of paper, and sometimes they were as long as 6 pages long. And we realized that this might not be the most helpful way when we're working with survivors. So Each safety plan is absolutely an individualized plan. And the most important thing is that it is based on the survivor's perspective and not on ours. So it is so important to listen to survivors and make sure that we are helping them identify what it is that they feel that they want or need in this situation. So what is it that they want to accomplish? Because sometimes it is not going to be that they are ready to leave an abusive relationship. Sometimes it is not because they don't want to. Sometimes it's because they actually physically aren't able to. When we talk about things like economic factors, there may not be the ability to leave a relationship at this point in time. So listening to a survivor and actually really listening to a survivor and helping them identify how they can feel safer while also integrating what we know and our knowledge and resources into that survivor's framework. So they may know the ways that they can keep themselves from physical harm, but we may know more of the resources that can be available to survivors and educating them on that. So it is absolutely kind of a team approach when we're safety planning with somebody. It is not us telling them what they need to do. A safety plan needs to be flexible and it needs to be ongoing, and we always want to make sure when we have the ability to check back in with the survivor that we are, to make sure that any factors haven't changed. Is the safety plan that we worked out working for you? And as always, safety plan is not a guarantee of safety. So when we talk about the conversation that we want to have with a survivor, one of the big things that we're going to want to make sure we're identifying is that person's risk of lethality, which I know is a hard conversation to have, and it can be scary. And we don't go into any of this just to scare a survivor, but we do want to know how certain things that they're experiencing in this relationship could lead to a higher risk of lethality. So domestic violence homicides are rare, but 3 to 4 victims are killed every day by their current or former partner. So it is a very real and very pervasive problem. The more danger signs that we see present in a domestic violence or intimate partner violence relationship, the greater risk of physical injury or death to that survivor. Now, that doesn't mean that just because they have a lot of the things on the lethality screens that they are automatically going to be killed by their intimate partner. But it is important on our end to make sure that survivors understand that certain things that we see in these relationships can absolutely increase the danger. So on the next slide, you'll see the risk of danger and lethality. It can increase when we see threats to harm, kill themselves or the victim. So when we see threats of suicide, that's always a red flag for us. When we see things like use of weapon, access or ownership of guns, and this includes no matter who owns the gun. So if there is a gun in a home where there's domestic violence going on, regardless of if that gun is owned by the abuser or by the survivor, that can increase their lethality. Strangulation is the biggest predictor of future violence and more severe violence. And it's something that we are learning more and more about. We used to always think that guns was the number one predictor. It is actually guns are behind strangulation. We also see that strangulation, when you have abusers that use strangulation as a tool in their relationships, that is also a bigger indicator for other crimes as well. So I'm sure you guys have heard on the news about some of these people that have committed mass shootings. A lot of times they have been domestic abusers themselves, that they've used strangulation on their intimate partners. So this is a huge thing. This is also something, when we go back to talking about the minimization, abusers almost always minimize strangulation. So when you are talking with an individual who says that they were possibly choked in a relationship, it is very important to take that very seriously. And if they are minimizing it, to help them understand that it is not something to minimize, that it is absolutely very serious. A lot of times they won't call it strangling, they will call it choking, or he grabbed me around my neck, or he yoked me up. So they don't always call it strangulation. In fact, more often than not, they don't. So it's important to ask some of those questions so that they can understand that there's that whether you call it yoking it up, whether you call it choking, that it is actually strangulation. Risk of danger obviously increases when we have the separation or termination of a relationship, as we talked about before. When there is drug or alcohol use on the part of the abuser, it can increase lethality. On the next slide, you will see that the risk of danger and lethality increases when we talk about stalking or surveillance. So if you see somebody that is stalking, especially after a relationship has ended. Oh, did you guys lose me for a minute?
Nope, you're still there.
Okay, I thought I lost connection. Okay, so when you see stalking behavior, that is a risk of a greater risk of lethality. Sexual assault, obsessive or controlling behavior, animal abuse is always an indicator, and then abuse during pregnancy. And so this is there's 2 points to abuse during pregnancy I want to mention. One is that if there is abuse during pregnancy, that can increase the danger and lethality to the survivor. We also will see an increase in abuse during pregnancy a lot of the time. Especially, you'll see violent behavior directed towards areas of the body that could affect that pregnancy. So if there's suddenly, kicking to the stomach and stuff like that, it's important to understand that that is a very serious thing that we're seeing. Nothing disrupts the power and control of an abusive person like a child entering into this situation. So that's why we see that, because if a survivor of domestic violence isn't ready to leave, she very well could be ready to leave once she finds out that she's pregnant. So we see an increase in violence a lot of times when there's a pregnancy. I'm sorry, I'm getting a call on my end. I'm sorry. Can you guys hear that? Okay. So when we talk about effective communication, we want to make sure that when we are safety planning with survivors, that we are really listening to what it is that they're saying, so that we can make sure that the safety plan that we are developing with them is the best working plan for them. So we want to make sure that we are truly listening, that we are reflecting back to them with compassion what we have heard, that we are honoring their courage for surviving and for sharing. It's very important to always validate what this survivor has experienced. We always, always, always want to believe a survivor. So we should never do any sort of questioning of the behavior, of their behaviors, or whether we do it on purpose or not, that survivor feels that we don't believe them in any way. We always want to make sure that we are believing survivors. We want to make sure that we connect them with the safety and supports that are going to be best for them. So understanding your community resources is very, very important. When we talk about safety planning with survivors, the more we know our resources in our community, the better we can connect them to those resources. So reflective listening, just certain phrases that you can use when we're communicating with a survivor. So correct me if I'm wrong, or I get the impression, what I'm picking up on, and then that gives the person that we're talking to the ability to correct us if we have misinterpreted what it is that they're saying, so that they can understand that we are truly invested in listening to them and making sure that we're working with them. So barriers to communication, some of this may seem pretty common sense. Harmful phrases, though, you don't always want to say I understand, because you don't necessarily understand what it is they're going through. Even if you have experienced domestic violence yourself, your experiences and how you have dealt with those experiences could be very different than this individual that you're working with. So it's important to keep that in mind. Know the difference between sympathy and empathy. When you're being sympathetic, it's not necessarily being genuine. So when somebody is explaining to you what they've experienced, you don't want to just try to look for the silver lining. You don't want to say things like, you're lucky that. It's not our job to put anything into perspective for them. It's our job to listen to what they've experienced and validate what they've experienced and how they feel about that. We don't know how they feel, so you don't want to say, I know how you feel. You don't want to say, try to be strong for your children, or try to convince them to leave for their children. Any of us who have children understand that we are always thinking about our children. We're never not thinking about our children. And when we're in these relationships, we're not staying in these relationships because we're not thinking about the children. So it's really important to remember that, and it's not our job to try to convince them to leave for their children. Never tell anybody to calm down. And I always joke that this is a general rule in life, and in your own perspective or in your own relationships. Don't tell people to calm down, or why didn't you? Again, that goes back to maybe questioning their behaviors and making it seem like they did something wrong. I think you should. That's never really good. Sometimes survivors will ask you what they should do, and sometimes they really genuinely want to know what they should. They want you to tell them what to do. But it's really important to never tell them what they should do. You can give them options and help them identify the best option for them based on their situation, but not telling them what they should do. So safety planning and academic advocacy. So you want to work with counselors, professionals, financial aid offices, anyone that's coming in contact with these individuals. It's always a good idea to create survivor support groups or any sort of safe spaces for people to go to that they can talk to. So if you're, I know some college campuses have, kind of Title IX offices where they can provide a place for survivors to go. And this is both for intimate partner violence, for sexual violence, but any sort of safe spaces you can create for survivors is really important. And then when you have somebody that is experiencing this, and when you're safety planning them, finding ways that you can work with the school to better keep the students safe. So can you do things like change a survivor's schedule around, or changing the safety plan for every semester if that changes? If the survivor is living with their abusive partner, are there ways that you can help them, move into to get different housing, or what that would look like? So when we talk about being empowering, we always operate under the empowerment through advocacy model, which we want to make sure that we're always respecting confidentiality. All conversations should happen in private, and this is something that when we're dealing with people who are at the kind of the general college age level, a lot of times you know, especially girls, I think, can travel in packs a little bit. So they'll bring their friends with them to conversations. And I completely understand that. But you always want to make sure that you're respecting confidentiality, and that conversation that you're having with that person happens just between the two of you. They always, though, have the right to have an advocate present for any conversations, and this does include in the courtroom. This does include when they're talking to a prosecutor. Domestic violence advocates can go with a survivor to any of those things. So believe and validate, as I said, I said before, we always want to make sure that we are believing survivors and that we are validating them and letting them know that they are not alone. Acknowledging the injustice, let them know that it is not their fault. Respecting autonomy, understanding that they are the experts in their life. They know their abusive partner better than the rest of us do, and so listening to them. Always make sure that we're safety planning, promoting access to community resources, and again, know the resources in your area. So this is just a question to get you thinking, how can you partner with local groups on and off campus? Wherever you are located and whatever your campus looks like is going to be different. So find out what your community offers, what are the resources that are available, and what's the relationship between the university and those resources, and kind of be strengthened. And then on the next slide, you'll just see some general resources that you can always look into. There's always specific resources, in your specific community. But our resources, the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, we have access to a lot of different trainings and tools that you can use. Loveisrespect.org and breakthecycle.org are both resources that you can use and get information from. Futures Without Violence is also a great resource, especially when it comes to things like training. When we talk about younger individuals in these relationships and intimate partner violence, there's a couple of really great apps that are available. The One Love Foundation has a lot of great information and is geared more towards the younger population of students, and so I would encourage you to explore that, as well as the app, the My Plan app, which can help with safety planning for individuals, so you can access that information. Does anybody have any questions about any of that?
I don't see any questions right now. If anybody does have some, please use the chat room to include them, or it looks like Emily has provided her contact information. If you have a campus-specific or situation-specific question that you would like to reach out to her or others at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, you are definitely welcome to call them and seek their most expert advice and their experience and things. See if any questions come in. Any final thoughts, Emily, from experiences that you've had in partnering successfully with campuses?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is making sure that each campus kind of has a safe place for survivors to go. A lot of times the resources within the greater community can be geared a lot towards geared less towards people who are younger or on college campuses. And so starting from within is really important, and making sure that survivors have a safe place that they can access on campus would be the first step. So I would implore anyone to find out, does your campus have that? Working with Title IX offices to get that if it isn't. And then a great way is to partner with the domestic violence agency in that community to help bridge that gap in that communication.
Great. Well, seeing no questions come in, Emily, I want to thank you again for your time and your expertise today, and thank you to all of you out there who did join us. If you'd like a copy of the webinar, you can email me directly. Otherwise, thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.